So we've been in this study called Time Passages for the last 8 weeks. Tonight is study number 9. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at really fairly recent history. We're going to talk a little bit about 1990 and forward from there. And I titled this era of time Technology and Turmoil. And I think it's important to understand that this period in church history is still being written. It is something that I don't think is finished, and I don't know that we have complete understanding of where the church has gone until another generation kind of looks back on it with better clarity than those of us who are living right through it. So take what I say to a certain extent with a grain of salt. And I don't mean that what I'm telling you is untrue, but what I'm doing is just making some observations, and it'll later be known whether these observations actually played a significant role in the history of the church or not. But as we have done in the last few weeks, we have talked about the turning points from the previous week. So let me remind you of that. There's 3 different ideas that developed that happened in the preceding era: nationalism, communism, and individualism. World War I, World War II, the rise of Nazism. Um, and in spite of 2 world wars, the church survived and even kind of thrived in some elements of it. It's amazing that the war and the revolutions that it produced kind of spawned uh, an interest in uh, the things that Christ had taught. And we talked last week a little bit that with the rise of Nazism, the German church, led by Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth, established what was called the Confessing Church, calling the Reich Church back to the teachings of Jesus. And they called that the Confessing Church. And it kind of saw the church in Germany and in Europe through that period of time. However, that period of time as a whole had a dramatic effect upon society. Between those 2 world wars, it's estimated that over 10 million people were killed. And that is, I don't know how you could ignore that. It has a huge impact upon humanity and upon history and church as well. So then we talked a little bit about the Scopes trial with the studies of Charles Darwin and a couple of the books that he wrote. And then we kind of finished up our study last week with the ecumenical movement, the World Council of Churches being established, trying to cross denominational lines for the sake of Christ's work in the world. And then we talked lastly about Vatican II and a little bit of a softer approach by the Roman Catholic Church to work with other organizations and try to be attentive to poverty and the needs of humanity as a whole. So that was the preceding era that we looked at, which we called the Age of Ideologies, 1914 to 1989. So tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about technology and some of the turmoil that comes with the development of technology. And I've given you a picture to kind of summarize each era, and here's the one I want to show you for tonight. So this is a worship service. And in a mega church, this is how they run their service. You can see multiple monitors, multiple computers, soundboards, that type of thing. And you actually almost have to have an engineering degree to be able to balance all those things. Usually they are trying to mix sound-wise various instruments, and usually these worship teams can be 8 or 10 people large. And so you're talking almost a concert-like venue. And so with technology comes all kinds of development. I think with technology also comes the opportunity to use video that accompanies sometimes the music that runs in the background. So if you've been to a concert recently, most recent one that Esty and I went to was the Eagles a few years back, and they had a backdrop of video that kind of coordinated with the song selections that they were singing and so forth. And with technology comes amazing ability to dazzle crowds and impress them, but it also puts a lot of pressure, talking about smaller churches, to be able to produce the type of experience that people often lean into emotionally. So with technology comes all kinds of wonderful things, but it also produces some turmoil because sometimes what happens is people become very consumeristic in their approach to church, just like they do anything else. So, with that in mind, we're going to kind of come to uh, several different factors tonight. And as we do so, let's take a look at this introduction. So, in 1989, um, the end of the Cold War that had been taking place between the United States and allies against other nations um, came to an end, and even the Soviet Union broke apart. And you see some of that desire to recapture the glory days of the Soviet Union with some of the moves that are being made. But um, with that, now comes a whole new era. We're not so much afraid of the communist threat anymore. And so the church doesn't have to be afraid of that. When we talk a little bit about church history still being in the process of being written, it'll be interesting to see where human history goes in the next 10 years, whether these things will resurface. I think some of the tensions that you're feeling a little bit about China, Ukraine, Palestinian, all these things that we're seeing in the news on a regular basis might have some impact upon the church into the future. But for now, it's primarily technology that has influenced not only church life, but our entire life. It has changed kind of the way we do work. Think about it. So many people are now working from home full time. And since COVID, especially, there's a lot of real estate of empty offices now because people found out that they can do their jobs from their home, and companies can uh, take off the top some of those expenses for square footage of offices and so forth. Um, with that comes a unique ability to communicate. We're using one of them tonight, and that's Zoom. The ability to communicate all the way down to Florida, here in Ohio, and other places, if other people joined in, is a remarkable thing when you think about being able to hold a Bible study together across so many miles. Uh, and this has led to the church thinking a little bit about how to do outreach. No longer is it in person. With the development of podcasts, with the development of YouTube and other media platforms, there's a whole new way of engaging with the world. And yet at the same time, there's some loss that is taking place, the loss of community, the loss of in-person connection, the ability to just be relaxed and let the meeting take you where you want it to go is so much more personal when it's face to face than on a computer. So, with that comes different contexts that the church is trying to embrace. In doing some research for tonight's study, I thought this one that I discovered and did not know anything about until just this past week is astounding. Back in 2019, the Vatican released an e-rosary bracelet, smart device that was designed to be activated when a person made the sign of the cross, and then they could then have this e-rosary lead them through some of the traditional prayers of the rosary. I I didn't even know that had existed, but that interplay of technology and tradition is an interesting one that is taking place. New technology being employed with signing kids into children's ministry has developed over the last 10 to 15 years. I have not run into this, but in doing some research, some churches are using technology to monitor church attendance by facial recognition software. Now, that is a bit invasive, I think, but some of these things, you see how blurry the line can get here on the good use of technology versus it's an invading thing to privacy and that type of thing. And I just mentioned COVID. Everything has changed since COVID, and some of the extreme challenges, I think, with COVID has been being outside the church building so long that it has really been tough getting people who have developed new habits to get them back into a church venue. And I know that's certainly true with Shade Tree, but I think it's also true with most churches that they have found that COVID was a game changer in many respects. And so we try to move ahead and we try to continue to do what we can do. But sometimes when people get into habits, they don't break those habits by just coming into church maybe once every 2 months or so. And I think what I've noticed is that people who come to church, but they don't do it on a weekly basis enough to make it part of their routine, is still primarily affected by the new habit that they had developed. So let me stop there and see if you have any thoughts or input on what we've talked about so far. Now, with technology comes complications, and the complications usually intersects with science. And what I mean by that is, when we watched movies in the past, everything from as archaic science fiction as Frankenstein to The Matrix or whatever it may be, there is some things that seem to be kind of far-fetched, but is not as far-fetched now because technology has provided the melding together of both our humanity and artificial intelligence, robotics, all these type of things that when you think about it, what are people going to do for a living in the future if robots and artificial intelligence takes their jobs and takes their careers away? So you can see it gets quite complicated. With that also comes the use of fetuses. I know that's been around for a long time. What is the ethical use of fetuses that are non-survivable for research, for medical advancements? So technology really does complicate things quite a bit. And let's face it, when you open the Bible, you're not going to find a chapter and verse on any of this type of thing. You're navigating using kind of a biblical ethic and wisdom and what's best for humanity, because you can't turn to chapter and verse on most of these things and prove anything. It's the Bible's time bound in that sense. And so when you think about all the advances that are made, and then you think a little bit about how some of the discoveries of science raises even spiritual and theological questions. Is there life on other planets? And If there is, how does that intersect with the work of Christ or the revelation of God in other places in the universe? I mean, quite it gets quite complicated when you think about a lot of these type of things, and so it intersects with our humanity, is what I'm trying to say. How can we be the best human beings we can be? And where do we draw the line when it goes too far at that it violates our humanity in some respects? So that's kind of a topic that's beyond my ability. Don't know a ton of stuff about science, but that's just kind of my observation, at least at this point. Some thoughts? I think what we're seeing here in our own day and age is some cultural collisions. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of things that are impacting the Christian movement. And I think there's none more so than unbridled consumerism and individualism. Um, we think about only ourselves most of the time. And with that, there is also the desire to honor individual rights, but often those individual rights are not connected to the traditions of things that we have studied about the last 8 weeks, and how do we honor the history that's come before us, and those type of things. So this isn't just a Christian thing, this is also a national thing. What do we do with our own history as a country, and then how does that intersect with human rights and our constitution, and all of those type of things come into play here. But I think more than anything else, when I went back to this picture here, and you think about the impact of consumerism in many respects, a lot of this is very consumeristic because it's very professional. So a lot of times people want the best music, the best children's ministry, the best youth ministry, um, and and a lot of that plays into technology, but most of all, it plays in to our own privilege of being able, for the most part, unless we're on the very lower end of the economic scale, we have so many privileges that we just take for granted that we become very individualistic in many respects. And I think that kind of creates this cultural collision that you often find in church. And I think if you ever went to a pastor's conference or a pastor's meeting, there's a lot of lamenting among the clergy because they don't know how to keep up or how to even broach the subject when you're on the smaller scale of church life. So out of consumerism often comes special interests, and they're not bad necessarily, but what the church was sufficient to do at one time has become individualized in special interest parachurch ministries. And these are type of crossover ministries that address specific needs. So you have women's ministries, men's ministry, you have recovery ministries, all these very specialized type ministries. And that's terrific in a sense. And in another sense, the community that you used to look to find strength is kind of been outsourced to another organization, that type of thing. So, anyways, at the turn of the century, in the 90s and going into the 21st century, there's a lot of these type of evangelical ventures that developed. And what they did is they used a lot of marketing techniques um, to capture the interest of people and so forth. Technology, the arts, and that type of thing come into play, but sometimes it really does hit a felt need. So I'm going to give you one example of that. And this goes back to the year 1990. So this is a picture of a Promise Keepers gathering in Washington, D.C. This happened to be on October 4th, 1997. 700,000 men from all over the country came to Washington, D.C. Well, how did it lead to that? Well, the Promise Keepers ministry, which began out in Boulder, Colorado by a football coach, that started to have some rallies where men were invited to come in and to renew their faith and to address men issues, that type of thing, really took off. And they began having rallies really at multiple places, often using arenas or football stadiums for their gatherings. So back when I was at Erieside in the 90s, I remember Charlie Bauer and Don Kerniski and I think it was Perry Carosha. They went to Indianapolis to one of the Promise Keeper rallies, and they came back and they were all excited and enthused about it. And then they were having another one in Detroit the next year. So a number of us went up to that, and it was very well done. Um, and then there was this idea of bringing men from across the United States to Washington, D.C. And this was called a Stand in the Gap rally. And actually, I went to it with Kevin and some guys and their sons at Erieside back in 97. And the themes of spiritual renewal and family responsibility, even racial reconciliation was a part of that. This was a very evangelical movement. As the years went on, though, it became, I think, very straight white American Christian type thing, that it kind of this is what we want the male to look like, if you're following what I'm saying. So rather than kind of a spiritual revival, it was kind of an attempt more than anything to kind of reestablish a gender role. Men, make sure you take your place in the home and all that type of thing, which um, I think that went a bit too far. So a good thing can often sometimes go off course a little bit. That's my opinion. But anyways, these are some of the types of movements that kind of rose in the 90s into the 2000s. And trying to think, you ladies went down to downtown Cleveland. I'm trying to remember what the name of that was. Oh gosh, it escapes me. So on the female side, there was similar type things that were going on. So um, any questions on that? Thoughts? So obviously, then the other thing that became very dominant in the 90s was church growth movements. Now, by church growth movement, what I mean is the aim was to build a mega church. The more people, the better. So the church growth movement, and that's not an official title of any organization, it's just a description of this era of time, also was within evangelical Christianity, and they used a lot of research. The Barna Foundation used a lot of research to give uh, churches the ability to see what people want and to do it to the best of their ability. And so what happened was you had you had churches, and this was one of the forerunners. Willow Creek Community Church up in Chicago started under the youth ministry of Bill Hybels back in the 70s, and then it grew into not just a mega church where they averaged about 12,000 attendees a week. They also developed the Willow Creek Association, where There was groups of churches that wanted to know kind of what their principles were that allowed them such tremendous growth. And I myself went to a number of conferences up there just to figure out what they were doing right. And what I found out is there's no particular schematic that works the same in any two places. That's kind of the downfall of this. You can take principles away, but you can't really duplicate it. But here's what I think the adverse effect from the church growth movement. Uh, what happened was when you combine this with individualism, and they did the best of the best. I mean, really, everything was professional and very well done. Well, people would often be drawn to that, and it might be a particular preacher that they liked, like Alistair Begg down at Parkside Church or someone like that, or the seasonal draw of a church, the chapel down in Akron. Always had some of the most beautiful Christmas concerts you'd ever want to go to. Um, Different things like that kind of attracted the crowd. Well, that's fine if you just want to go and participate in that. But what it really did was the church growth movement, again, my opinion, some of it was out of unchurched people beginning to come to church, but usually the majority of it was transfer growth. And it was people leaving their church to go to a better church. And so what that did, the full effect of it was traditional churches, I'll just use that as a descriptor for right now, began to see their congregations shrink. And as they did so, what we found is that during this period of time, a traditional church was doing well if they could have 100 people attending a service. Usually it was about 50 or 60 people in a traditional church. Well, that was one of the adverse effects of the church growth movement is, yeah, it was reaching unchurched Harry and Mary, but it was really drawing people away from their own church, and with them leaving their own church, then it also left traditional churches in financial pinches because they took their money with them. So it gets complicated. It really does. And it's wonderful. A lot of these church growth mega churches have reached a lot of people for Christ, and that's great and that's wonderful. But on the downside of it, the smaller community of the church was affected dramatically by this period of time. Have some thoughts there at all?
I think the women's things was called Women of Faith.
Women of Faith, that's what it was. Yeah, I couldn't remember what
And
it was.
every year they had a different topic or a different tagline.
A different
Women
theme. Yeah.
different women of joy, women of whatever.
Yeah. Anybody else have any? All right. So now, when you couple all of this is why I call it kind of an age of turmoil, technology and turmoil. You also see pluralism on the rise here. So here's a guy climbing up the ladder, and he has multiple choices of what religion he could study. I mean, that wasn't available pre-technology. I mean, with the advent of the internet, you could learn more about Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, or smaller religions. And uh, people began to not be less spiritual, but they began to look at where the church was and what it was doing and some of the scandals that were taking place within the church, and they began to direct their spiritual interest into other areas. And so now Christianity does not have their ear. And what I think is happening is this down at the bottom of the slide here had a lot to do with the disenchantment of it. sexual abuse among clergy, and then presbyteries and bishoprics and different things covered up a lot of that type of stuff. And of course, we all remember Jimmy Swaggart's sexual escapade and others like him. And then a lot of profiteering. I'm going to mention in a moment this whole prosperity theology that began to come in was challenging people to give a lot of money, and usually it was older people that gave a lot of their much needed resources to the church, thinking that God was going to double their blessing because they gave a certain amount of money, and then other issues of integrity and all that type of thing. So when you add all that together, uh, the advent of technology to be able to have at your fingertips information that you never had, and then all these other things that were going wrong within Christianity led to a lot of an exit of Christianity. And of course, we know that a term that we have used in the past is a lot of people had to deconstruct from a lot of hurtful things that had happened to them, either personally or uh, just by principle of what the church had done. And so some people are coming back to the faith, others have written it off completely. But and deconstruction is also a positive thing, where you question some of the things that you're being told as to whether it is true or not. So thoughts there. Okay, this is a big one right now. The world is on the move, and it's becoming more and more pronounced um, with within politics, especially, that there is a refugee crisis at all times where people are fleeing for their lives and for their families' protection, and they're going to other places where they feel that they need to go to protect their family. And so you have these regimes that are just despicable and violent, and gangs and all this type of thing, drugs that sometimes are so rampant that the neighborhood is no longer safe, that type of thing. And so they seek asylum in various countries. And you'll see sometimes it's not just our southern border, it's all over the world where people are seeking refuge just so that they can protect their family and find a place to be able to raise their family and feed their family and that type of thing. And the question is always, well, where do we go to survive? And a lot of that has put a lot of pressure on different countries. What do we do with a massive movement of people to our border? And just be careful. This is used as a political tool quite a bit. You have to kind of see through the propaganda of it when you hear terms like, we have an open border. Well, that's not true. There might be people that sneak across a border, but we don't have an open border. There are policies in place, and if a person is going to seek asylum, they have to apply for it, and they have to go before a judge, and sometimes they don't always do that. But what I'm saying is, to describe an open border, you would think that you can cross the border as easy as you cross the street. Well, maybe that might be true in some parts, but where there are rivers, where there are walls, where there are patrols, there's no open border there. Sometimes people um, take their own lives into their hands, and we see that with some of the boat people that leave places and try to make it to the shores of America from various places, and they drown en route, that type of thing. Um, I would say just be careful of that, but you can't ignore it. It is something that's very real. And I don't think we need to live in fear. nor should we be afraid of immigrants. Um, I think the fact is we're a nation of immigrants, and what happened at one time is still happening even today, where people are seeking a better life. So some Christians will want to welcome refugees and help them and try to do the very best they can. Others will turn their back and sometimes do some very um, unchristian things that are trying to push people back in to their own country. So just be careful. This being a election year, just be aware that this is a football that political leaders love to use to their own advantage. And so, but it's something that is happening around us, and we need to be aware of it. All right. Okay, another big thing that happened in the 90s and into the 2000s is there were massive movements that began. I just showed you the picture of the church growth movement, Willow Creek Community Church. There, though, was also some very big movements that captured the really market of various parts of Christianity. And Hillsong, especially, was a movement out of Australia that basically wrote probably the majority of contemporary Christian worship songs. Um, Remember, we talked last week about the Azusa Street Mission and the outpouring of the Spirit all the way back to 1906, where uh, finally blacks and whites are worshiping together, and that becomes the basis for Pentecostalism, and the outpouring of the Spirit would uh, be cross-cultural in many respects. Well, what we find is that this form of spirituality of charismatic revivalism did not die. It kind of resurfaced in various ways. And it began with a church out in Redding, California called Bethel Church. They're still around. They're not as big as Hillsong, but Hillsong began in 1983 and expanded all around the world. And they became a spotlight for celebrities as well. So I know Justin Bieber and others would go to Hillsong, that type of thing. And these were kind of the celebrated congregants, that, oh, this is the hip place to go, that type of thing. So, you have still a broad spectrum of those type of movements, even within our own country as well. And it becomes the cool place to go. And what happens though most of the time is when a movement becomes so big, usually motives get mixed. And what happened with Hillsong is there was a lot of scandal. If you have Netflix, I don't know if it's still on there or not, but they did a documentary series. And when did we watch that? That was, gosh, maybe a year or two ago. I don't even know. But it kind of shows where they went astray. The series was called A Mega Church Exposed, Hillsong, A Mega Church Exposed. So you can look on Netflix, and I think it was 4 episodes, if I'm not mistaken, of these individuals. This is Brian Houston here that began the movement. And this was the guy that ran the New York City branch of Hillsong. And these guys became very shady. And I don't know who these other two are. I just captured this picture off the internet. But um, this is something I think that you always have to have your ear to the ground on is, when something becomes so big, when does it become a business? And when do they begin to exploit their congregants for their own gain and all that type of thing? So that's the turmoil, I think, of um, our current era of church history. Now we're going to turn the corner here to a different part of the world and think about that just for a minute. But any questions or comments? So also in the 2000s, 1990s, even before that, really, there was a great burst of movement in Christianity in what was called the Global South. Now, the Global South, it included Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And the European form of Christianity began to wane. In fact, Europe became very secularized, considering it was kind of the uh, bedrock in many respects of the Reformation and all that type of thing. But church growth really came from these three areas: Latin America, Africa, and Asia. In 1910, 80% of all Christians lived in Europe and North America. By 2010, a slight majority of Christians, that is greater than what is found in Europe and in the West in North America, live in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Now, much of that is related to the Catholic Church, but projection is, and we're not that far away. Um, those that are watching the trends they're saying by 2025, 70% of all Christians will be living in the global South. That's a staggering number. That we're only a year away from that, where the 70% of Christians are. So you flipped from 80% of Christians living in Europe and North America to 70% living in the global South. Much of that is related to three things. Uh, Pentecostalism is one. Prosperity theology is another one. Those two things are very instrumental in other parts of the world. But the third one is liberation theology. And that kind of started to come to the surface in the 70s. And it's this idea that revolution is sometimes needed to overthrow a lot of the oppression that has caused poverty. And much of that is directed by the Catholic Church against oppressive regimes and so forth. So when you take a look here, um, what is being pushed against is the effects of colonialism. So prior to World War II, many of the non-Western world countries were controlled by these four nations: Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Portugal. And they try to impose their own, sort of like Alexander the Great did upon the world that he conquered. He Hellenized the known world at that time. Well, colonization was imposing your cultural values upon another culture. Well, often there was a lot of oppression, and there was often rights that were not given to people that were being colonized. And so this created a lot of perception problems for Christianity. They're an oppressive movement, and they're only out to use us, that type of thing. Well, in Africa, especially, there was a lot of that. And in the name of Christianity, there were a lot of men who would call themselves Christians that were slave traders and other things of the sort. Now, remember, when we go all the way back to Alexandria, Egypt, there were some prominent theologians that came out of Africa. Origen, Augustine, Tertullian were three to name a few. And now Christianity is being overshadowed by colonization. And much of the missions movement that we talked about last week and the week before, while the goal was good for global evangelization, yet at the same time, there was a lot of colonization that was taking place as well, trying to get people to become more Western. in their mentality and outlook and so forth. So do you see how complex this gets? It's something that is not easy to understand, nor is it easy to um, you know to turn back or push back. So notice what happened. So in Africa, indigenous Christianity would be replaced because of colonization techniques by Islam, which is its own form of colonization. So you see on this map here of Africa, you see how many of these have some type of crescent moon in them. That represents Islam. Okay. So North Africa, especially, has a lot of Muslims that um, was part of the taking over of this continent. So by the late 19th century, as you can see here, there began to be a pushback by Christians in Africa. And they developed a movement called the African Independent Churches. And their goal was to purge these colonial influences that they felt were corrupting their heritage and their history and that type of thing. So their desire was for African people to be able to thrive on their own, to be productive, and to do it in their own way. Not to be oppressed or controlled or manipulated by these other countries. And so they would try to unite and kind of work against this external influences. So if you ever run into Africa Independent Churches as a name, that's what that is. It was a pushback on colonization. So here you have Africa. Now you have Latin America. Latin America is a hotbed at times. And after Vatican II that we talked about last week, there was more of a concentration on the church instead of um, oppressing people in the sense of you have to keep the Latin Mass, you have to do this, you have to do that. They began to reach out and began to establish different ways of reaching the poor. And of course, Mother Teresa fits into this, her life and her outreach to the poor. A lot of what happened back in the 1930s was urbanization. So you had a lot of people migrating into cities in Latin America, so much so that it became difficult to prevent poverty and destitution from occurring, not enough jobs for people, that type of thing. But because of Vatican II, church leaders began to not only try to reach out to the poor, they began to also talk about systemic injustice. Those type of injustices by the powerful, pushing down the commoner. And out of that grew what is called liberation theology. And liberation theology became a theological framework that began to push back on the systemic injustice of people. And they are trying to use their outreach to the poor as a way of momentum. But within liberation theology, there's a lot of the political vision that's borrowed from Marxism as well. So now you have a mix of political and theological elements that are kind of merged together. For some of the liberation theologians, they tried to push for social change. Well, sometimes that led to violence, that led to rioting, sometimes that led to revolution. And so, what often happened is some of these Latin Americans, I'll name four of them in particular, that was real hotbeds: Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Chile. These four nations became hotbeds for liberation theology and some of the pushback. Well, what are people going to do that are in power? Well, they're going to try to push back and prevent change from happening. So a lot of that turmoil, we still feel some of the effects of that turmoil, don't we? Even to this day. Now, how's the big one? Prosperity theology. Here is Joel Osteen.
No.
When he wanted to find a new place for his church, you know what he did? He bought the arena that the Houston Rockets NBA basketball team used before they built a new arena. So why did he become so popular? He, I think, is an individual that is not as he is not as bad as some other prosperity theologians for sure, but he kind of leans that way. And so, in many respects, here you have the global South, poverty, powerlessness, fear, a lack of agency. And in North America, you have these churches that are starting to expand. And I think Joel Osteen's weekly attendance is somewhere around between 25 and 30,000 people a week. So it's like going to an NBA game every Sunday morning when you go to church. And this prosperity theology did catch the attention of the global South as well. And a lot of preachers began to take advantage of people in the global South saying, you see the success that's happening in North America. If you buy this idea, it can happen here as well. They were being lied to because there's so much more than just a faith seed that led to the prosperity elements that are often enjoyed within our own country. But what you find here at the bottom of this whole prosperity movement is prosperity theology says if you have material advances, if you have any wealth, if you have good physical health, that's a sign that God is blessing you. If you have trouble, if you are sick, if you are poor, that's a sign that God is displeased with you. So you need to get your life right. And the best way to do it is to send in a seed contribution to me, that type of thing, right? Well, the truth is, if you look into the life of Christ, who is it that he ministered to the most? It was the poor. It was the marginalized. It was the people on the margins that he touched, and he never condemned them at all. Who was he most critical of? The Pharisees, the people that were trying to control religiously the people and the monetary elements that came along with that. So you see, a lot of times things haven't changed a bit in 2,000 years. A lot of the same old story is happening. You have any thoughts there? And of course, this came into play as well. Islamic extremism, terrorism. There's the picture of the Twin Towers. I think we all kind of remember where we were when we heard the news. I was in my church office, and you know, it you had to run home and see what it in person and what was going on and that type of thing. Um, this this jihadism is something that's happened several places around the world. Um, Believe it or not, there was another group called the Boko Haram in Nigeria that was extremist group as well. We don't know a lot of the sub comments of these extremists. We know ISIS, we know those type of things, but there are these movements around the world that is a misuse of religion and really does not really represent the core of that religion. And you can't throw the whole religion out because of extremism. because we have our own extremists even within Christianity too. And so we have to be careful with that type of thing. All right. So migration to the cities, we can lament the problems that it might bring from homelessness and so forth, but it also afforded a lot of great potential and opportunities as well, because where there are greater amounts of people, where there's a bigger population, there's also the opportunity to reach more people and stuff. And I think that kind of ties in with the church growth movement and the mega churches as well. Usually these mega churches happen in high dense cities, and where there's a lot of population and that type of thing. And usually they're on the cutting edge, I think, too, of the type of cities that are always moving forward. Think of Chicago, New York, LA, a lot of these type of places that we catch up to, but they're usually the ones that set the trends a lot of times. But all right, so we're gonna wrap up. I'm not going to talk about this at all because we did a whole series on this actually a year ago, but I do want to mention this is going to play into the history of the church. And that is, what role did Christian nationalism play during this era of church history? But if you want to review that, we did that a little over a year ago. Back in January 2023, we talked a little bit about Christian nationalism on Wednesday nights, and that's on our YouTube, that's on our website, if you want to kind of go back and refresh your memory on a lot of that thing. I think what's most important as we close tonight is this first statement here. Christian nationalism fuses the kingdom of God with a preferred vision or version of the kingdom of God within the world. And somehow we disregard what is the First Amendment in our own Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. See, what happens within Christian nationalism is a merging of Christianity and American identity. And they're not held separately. So a lot of times Christian nationalism uses a lot of the verbiage that we've always been a Christian nation. That's debatable. But what I think is most dangerous about it is when you say to be a good American or to be a patriot, you must be Christian. That's when we are violating the First Amendment. And so we have to be careful of that as well. Christian nationalism is sort of forming a significant rift. I think we're seeing it. The nation is very divided right now. Not only the nation, but even churches and denominations. We're seeing it all around. I think that will be one of the defining characteristics of this era of church history. So here's my concluding thought for tonight. I'll just say it very quickly. The time passages of church history mark significant turning points in theology, liturgy, and spirituality. And we've looked at that in different eras of time. Second, as church history continues to be written before our very eyes, note the changes as part of the evolving and emerging work of God in the world. God is not off the throne, and he will continue to work, but it will evolve even as we as human beings evolve. And then finally, full understanding of our own events during our own lifetime can't be evaluated effectively by us. We're in the middle of it. We're like fish swimming in the water, right? That's our environment. So it's hard for us to be detached enough to give proper evaluation to it. So that will be the work of others, the church historians in generations to follow, to look back over their shoulder and to evaluate this era of time that we are in. So do you have any thoughts, questions? So we've covered a lot of territory. I think between the handouts, I have given you 62 pages of notes, if you kept them. But anyways, I hope it was helpful in kind of seeing the big picture and just kind of going through the different eras and seeing how things developed. And there's reasons for everything. Things just didn't happen. There's one thing that affects another thing that affects another thing. And that's the story of history, not just church history.
And thanks, Larry. I thought it was very informative, and appreciate all the work you put into it. I know there was a lot of work.
I enjoyed it. Like I said at the beginning, it was a study I've wanted to do for the past 35 years in ministry, and I just never got around to it. So thank you for being patient and forbearing in this process. So, all right. So next 2 weeks, we're going to take a break. And then on April the 3rd, we will start a 3-week video series on climate change. It will be a little bit longer because we'll show you the video. Then we'll just kind of make some comments about what was said in the video. Okay?
So when does your book come out?
I'm observing how hard it is just by watching you. I'm now writing a book.
Oh, come on.
This is all written though, Larry.
Yeah, right. That's right. All right, folks. I hope you have a great rest of the week, and I will hope to see you soon. Okay?
Yep.
All right.
Thank
All
you.
right, thanks.
All right.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye. Good
Good
night.
night.